I have a question. The stage 1 report of Ms. Jones, exhibit 10. Is that exhibit 10 in stage 1?
Yes.
Ah, thank you.
And JBD, it is a JBD document for stage 3 as well.
Thank you.
Your Honor, I've spoken with Madame Reporter. She says she's content to go till 3 because we understand that the plan is to end at 3 today. Is that right? So if everyone's okay, we'll do that.
Very good. Suit everyone here? Thank you.
So before the break, we had just finished the section about the transition of responsibility for Indigenous people. And now we're at page 20 of your slide deck, or slide 20. And this is about the Confederation of British North American Colonies 1858 to 1864.
Right. So just to recap where we left, we have in 1860 a situation where the same government, the same colonial government, is responsible for Indian affairs. Their officials are paid for and appointed by and responsible to the local legislature. The annuities are paid out of colonial revenues, as are all Indian Department salaries and other expenses. But that was a situation that was not going to persist for very long. You'll notice it's somewhat in opposition to the quotation from 1837 that I referred to earlier, which is that the imperial government believed that the government dealing with local land matters should not be the one that had responsibility for Indian affairs. So that does seem like a bit of a contradiction in 1860. But already by 1860, there was some discussion of a change.
Can I just ask when, so when in 1860, when the imperial government is saying that, there is only local government.
There is only the local colonial
on this continent.
Yes.
Okay.
In the province of Canada, there are municipal governments, which distinguishes them from, say, the maritime provinces where there weren't formally established municipal governments.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, there's only one level of government for the United Province of Canada. But already by 1860, there had been proposals to change this structure. As early as 1858, Alexander Tillich Galt, who was the Minister of Finance for the province of Canada, had proposed a plan for a confederation of British North American colonies, being the province of Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland.
Excuse me, are you saying that Galt's, or that any, that dealing with Indian affairs was a trigger for confederation?
No, I don't think I would say that.
Okay, so as early as 1858, a proposal to change this structure. What do you mean?
The structure from the governments of separate governments of the United Province of Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland.
The colonial.
The colonies in the northern part of British North America.
Thank you.
I should say the northeastern part of British North America, because there was there were other colonies on the west coast. But this Galt's plan was really more focused, I think, on the financial and economic and political issues facing the province of Canada at this time than, say, any issues regarding Indigenous populations. So the Galt plan was that by creating a larger entity, I should say at this time that the province of Canada had borrowed heavily in London to finance infrastructure projects such as canals. And it was beginning to invest heavily in railways. The size of the colony was really, I think you could say, disproportionate to some of the financial obligations that it was taking on. Some of the other maritime colonies were in a similar position. The province of Canada was in a political deadlock, again, because of the equal representation, the same number of seats from Upper Canada and Lower Canada. There were a number of very unstable coalitions that were formed between 1858 and 1866. And as we'll get into a little bit later, the overall idea was that by making a larger entity with more resources at its disposal and a larger population, it would be more feasible to take on better infrastructure development and economic and political development on a larger scale. So with this in mind, that in the maritime provinces, which had already been considering a union of their own, Galt and the other Province of Canada delegates, including John A. Macdonald, attended a meeting of maritime politicians at Charlottetown in August of 1864, which was only supposed to be about maritime union. But the Province of Canada delegates persuaded the maritime delegates to come to a further meeting at Quebec in October of 1864 to work out a broader confederation plan that might include all of them.
Slide 21, please.
So at the Quebec conference, there were politicians who spoke about many different aspects, both positive and negative, that this new confederation might offer. But Galt was the person who set out the financial structure, being the Minister of Finance for the province of Canada. And according to the other delegates, the only person who really had a command of the financial issues, both in the province of Canada and more broadly. So his proposal contained some of the following features. This isn't comprehensive, but it's a sketch. The new federal government was to assume all debts and liabilities of the former colonies. The new central government would also assume all of the cash and securities held by the former colonies, plus all of their key infrastructures, such as railways, harbors, and canals, and most of the major revenue sources for governments at the time, which were customs, excise, the post office, fees, say fees to use a canal, and all the residual revenue raising power. And the new provincial governments, which he would call the more local level of governments, were to have the, quote, lands, mines, minerals, and royalties vested in Her Majesty, plus all sums due from purchasers or lessees of such lands, mines, or minerals. But again, the new federal government was to take on all of the debt that all of these former colonies had accumulated, but also to take over almost all of their assets and revenue sources.
What did that mean for what you referred to earlier as the territorial revenue?
Well, the territorial revenue was partly comprised of revenues from the lands, mines, minerals, and royalties. But as I said before, most of it actually came from customs, and there were other fees and excise taxes that also made a large contribution to the territorial revenue.
And had been assumed by now by the New Dominion government, or the plan was.
Well, this was his proposal.
Yes.
yeah.
Slide 22.
So this would leave the new provincial governments, the more local level of governments, with an insufficient amount of money to meet the expenditures for which they would still be responsible under Galt's plan. So Galt proposed that the new central government was to pay each province a subsidy of 80 cents per capita, which was supposed to cover most of their expenses. And there were other arrangements because every colony was in a slightly different financial position and had been relying on different resource revenues, having different economies. There were special arrangements made for, say, New Brunswick, which was about to take on responsibilities for quite a large amount of railway debt. And really their primary source of revenue was timber dues, export duties on timber. So Galt assured them that they would continue to have that source of revenue, although generally export duties were to be taken over by the new central government. And he tried to accommodate some of these different situations in the different provinces, the different colonies in his financial arrangements. He came up with this idea of taking the total debt that all of the colonies owed at this time, which was an approximation, in 1864, he divided it by the total population of all of the colonies and arrived at an average per capita debt amount that he described as being at about $25 per person. So he then said every new province was going to be allowed to transfer debt to the new central government of their populations multiplied by $25. You'd say, well, but isn't the new central government going to take all the debt? And they did. The new central government was going to take all the debt. But the concern in the maritime provinces was that the province of Canada, who they regarded as being spendthrifts, had taken on a lot of debt to build infrastructure that the maritime provinces, being thrifty and independent, didn't want to have to be responsible for. So Galt came up with this idea to say, you thrifty, independent maritime provinces who have not yet run up debts to this level will have, we will take in all of your debt. And in fact, we're going to set a level, which is this population number multiplied by $25. And if you haven't, by the time Confederation happens, accumulated debts to that level, we'll actually give you 5% interest back on that difference, which you can add to your subsidy. Now, part of the thinking here as well was that they didn't want the component colonies of this new political entity to think, well, great, the central government is going to take over all my debt when this new entity is created, and go out and run up a large amount of new debt. So this was intended as a way of limiting the temptation to go out and borrow more money that would eventually be taken over by the new central government. Again, there was a special case made for New Brunswick because they had already committed to some significant expenditures on railway construction. But the province of Canada had more debt per capita than this $25 figure. So Galt said to the delegates, you maritime provinces will not be, through this new political entity, completely responsible for all that debt. We will have the province of Canada pay the new central government 5% interest every year on whatever the difference is between what their allowance was calculated to be, $62.5 million, and their actual debt when they entered Confederation. So while the central government was still assuming all of the debt of the colonies, of course, in order to assume that debt, it would have to issue securities or borrow money in London to cover that indebtedness, on which it would have to pay interest. And essentially what Galt's proposal was that over a certain limit, the province of Canada will reimburse the new central government for that interest that they would have to pay.
Reimburse or pay? Oh, they reimburse Canada's interest
Right,
costs.
right.
Thank you.
So that, for example, taxpayers in the maritime provinces wouldn't be paying any part of that additional borrowing that was required to cover the province of Canada debt.
Ms. Jones, it sounds like you might be referring to the first bullet on slide 23. Should we move on to the next slide?
Right. That is essentially the first bullet. And the second bullet. So while the provinces in the Maritimes would get a little money back on this idea of a debt allowance to be added to their subsidies, the amount of interest that the United Province of Canada would pay would be deducted from their subsidies.
Slide 24.
Now, one of the key objectives, it wasn't really all about the money, although that was part of it. One of the key selling points of this whole Confederation scheme was not only uniting the maritime provinces with the province of Canada, which, for example, would provide the province of Canada with access to year-round ice-free ports. The colonies would all have tariff-free access to each other's markets. The key objective was to expand this new colony, to incorporate the other British North American territories into a new country that would eventually border 3 oceans and contain what were then thought to be limitless resources. So they were very much painting a big picture for the delegates of what this little collection of colonies could be in the future. And one of the resolutions adopted at the Quebec conference referred to the importance of establishing, they called it communications with the Northwestern Territory, and the improvements required for the development of the trade of the Great West with the seaboard. In other words, to build not only connections between the existing colonies, but right across British North America and all the way to British Columbia and Vancouver Island. So that was going to be, after the initial Confederation, one of the first big projects that this new entity would undertake.
And that's what you're referring to there is one of the issues of highest importance in bullet 2.
Yes.
Slide 25.
So here's the map.
sorry, Ms. Jones, this map was not in your report, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, can you explain what the purpose of this map is?
The purpose of the map is just to orient ourselves at this time as to what we're referring when we're talking about British North America. I chose this particular one because it happens to be have quite clear borders and labeling, and some of the other maps I looked at didn't reproduce quite as well. So you can see there that Ontario and Quebec, that's the names at Confederation. It was the United Province of Canada in 1864, are very much smaller than they are today, being the watersheds essentially of the St. Lawrence River in British territory. Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick look more or less the same. But then we have this enormous territory to the north and the west, which is Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory. Rupert's Land was chartered to the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670 by the imperial government in Britain. The Northwestern Territory was not within the charter, but was under Hudson's Bay Company administration in the 1860s.
Not within the HBC charter.
But
Okay.
the Hudson's Bay Company administered that territory on behalf of the British government. And by administered, I don't mean that the Hudson's Bay Company established a formal government. It was part of their commercial empire. But the point is, there is no other operational government in that territory at the time. From the colonial perspective. So this is the project that was being considered in 1864 then, was to add these enormous territories, Rupert's Land and Northwestern Territory, and the colony of British Columbia, which were all part of British North America, but all separate entities at this time. So it's just so we can orient ourselves to what the geography of these plans really look like.
I believe you discussed the plans for expansion into Rupert's Land and other similar topics in your report, and also on this next slide, 26.
Yes. So another resolution in the Quebec Conference was that the central government would have jurisdiction over, quote, Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. There's no record of any discussion of this clause, in particular of the notes of the Quebec Conference. But it was a key element of this project to expand British North America and unite it into a larger political entity. The jurisdiction, central jurisdiction over Indians was essential to the new government's plans to expand the territory. One of the first things, just looking ahead a little bit, one of the very first things that the legislature of post-Confederation Canada did in 1867 was to send an address to the Queen requesting the transfer of Rupert's Land and undertaking that the claims of the Indians for compensation for lands required for the purposes of settlement will be settled and considered in conformity with the equitable principles which have uniformly governed the British Crown in dealing with the Aborigines. So that in particular is the treaty-making power which had been vested in the imperial government. And then in 1860, with the transfer of responsibility, the administration of that power had been passed to the local province of Canada government, which did enter into some agreements with Indigenous peoples between 1860 and 1867. And now this project, this Confederation project, identified jurisdiction over, quote, Indians, end quote, as a key element of its plans to expand into British North America.
You can go to the next slide, 27.
So again, I'm skipping forward a little bit here, but this is just a way of understanding why this clause was placed where it was in as early as the 1864 Quebec resolutions. Because we have little direct evidence from the attendees at this conference over exactly why this clause was developed and transferred to the central government, we can look at what the central government did immediately after Confederation as a way of getting some insight into why it was placed where it was prior to Confederation. If we look at the March 1869 terms of transfer between Canada, that's the new Dominion of Canada, and the Hudson's Bay Company for Rupert's Land, the big territory we saw on the map, it contains the clause, quote, "It is understood that any claims of the Indians for compensation for lands shall be disposed of by the Canadian government." So this implies the central government involvement for a few different reasons. First of all, because with the exception of local assembly in what was to become Manitoba, a small area to be called Manitoba, there were no pre-existing local governments, nor were there any particular plans to create any in Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory. So the only government that could take on this responsibility would be the central government in Canada. But Canada saw itself as the successor or the inheritor of the imperial responsibility to deal with Indigenous peoples. If you can trace the progression from the imperial government to the province of Canada to the new Dominion of Canada. And also Canada, in order to fulfill those obligations, was going to need to have the power, for example, to set aside lands for Indigenous people as part of treaty negotiations.
Can I just ask you, this is part of what you're answering now. You say that the central, what you're trying to, slide 27, you're trying to understand why this clause was placed in the 1864 resolution. And this clause is the clause that the central government would be responsible for all matters relating to Indigenous people.
Right.
And one of the things you say is that you can trace the responsibility from the imperial government to the province of Canada to the new Dominion of Canada. Is that we can trace that logically, or we can trace that in thinking, or we can trace that in what actually happened?
I think you can trace it in all of those ways.
Because isn't there a, like if you were tracing it logically, it wouldn't be from the imperial government to the province of Canada to the new Dominion of Canada, it would be from the Imperial Government to the Province of Canada to the Province of Ontario, or the provinces.
Well, but it's,
I'm not asking you to defend it so much, it's just I'm trying to understand what.
again, I
tracing.
think we do draw a little on the thread of the 1837, the expression of philosophy, I suppose, that responsibility for Indigenous people should not be entrusted to the level of government which is closest to the settler level. I think there is a little bit of that residually here. The British,
Which was honored more in the breach.
well, maybe we'll get to that
Oh,
later.
okay.
The imperial government itself was the new government of Canada did offer to make this undertaking, but the imperial government was also quite insistent on this point, to say, we have had a way in the past of dealing with Indigenous people. We understand that if you take over these new territories in Rupert's Land and the Northwestern Territory, that you inherit those principles and will be guided by them. So there's a two-way conversation going on between the imperial government and the government of Canada. The imperial government made this a condition of approving the transfer, the Rupert's Land transfer. And also of course, the new areas of British North America, the lands were going to be under the control of the new central government, which might seem like a bit of a contradiction to the earlier point about separating them. But, and this was how it worked out in practice as well, the central government had to have the power to promise and to set aside lands for Indigenous people as part of the treaty making process. And that applied not just to people that it called formerly Indians, but also to the Métis. There was a very large grant of lands made shortly after the Rupert's Land transfer as part of the creation of the province of Manitoba. There was a large amount of land set aside for the Métis people in Manitoba, which is another story, but the initial action was taken to set aside land. It would not have been able to do that, or it would have been very much complicated if it didn't have the power to deal with Indigenous people directly as the inheritor of those imperial principles.
Ms. Jones, is your answer you just gave an responsive to your point in bullet 2, where you said Canada retained administration and control of Crown lands and the newly acquired territories
Slow down, please.
to facilitate both settlement with the Indians and the construction of the Transcontinental Railway.
Right. So here MacDonald actually explicitly links the settlement he intends to make with the Indians, the guardianship of whom was involved. In other words, he recognizes that there is a relationship of guardianship with the interests of Indigenous people and the central government. And as well, of course, they are partly financing this big new railway project also by their control over the lands in the Northwestern Territories and the former Rupert's Land, by making very large land grants to the Canadian Pacific Railway. This was a colony that didn't have a lot of money, but it had a lot of land. So it paid for a lot of things by transferring lands.
When you say this, what are you referring to? The
Uh,
colony.
the new Dominion of Canada.
Okay, we can go to slide 28.
So that was just a little, that was a little bit of forward progress, just to shed some light on why the Quebec resolutions are drafted the way they are. These resolutions that were discussed at Quebec and adopted by the delegates there were debated in the colonial legislatures in 1865. So that includes the province of Canada. And the agreement at Quebec was that each legislature must adopt or reject the resolutions without making any changes. So it was an all or nothing kind of package. So the debates in the province of Canada legislature gave Galt an opportunity to provide more details on the proposed financial structure. Another advantage of these debates is that they are not quite verbatim, but they're pretty close. And I think reading some of the notes that were taken at the Quebec resolutions, I think sometimes even the people making the notes didn't fully understand what Galt was trying to explain. It was said at the time that Galt was really the only person that fully understood what his financial ideas were. But in these debates, we have an opportunity to see how he was trying to explain it firsthand in his own words. So in the debates, he introduces the idea that the amount of province of Canada debt in excess of this amount, this figure, which he has chosen, $62.5 million, could be attributed to debts of a local character, such as, say, these municipal loan funds that were established in the province of Canada. These were funds that would back municipal securities. Say if a city or a town wanted to build infrastructure on their own, they wouldn't have had the credit to borrow money for infrastructure. But if they were backed by a larger entity, such as the province of Canada, they could get access to money. So those kinds of, that kind of borrowing, he said, is clearly local because it pertains to a road or a drainage project in a particular municipality, just for an example. And he thought that that kind of debt could properly be managed or by local governments, whereas the big infrastructure projects that comprise most of the province of Canada debt, the public improvements such as the railways, canals, and harbors, which were to be the property of the central government, he said would roughly be covered by that $62.5 million. But, you know, I think we should understand that this is Galt trying to make this idea palatable to the members of the province of Canada legislature, who are probably saying, well, everyone else is having all of their debt assumed at no cost by the central government. Why are we paying 5% interest? So he tries to explain it this way. He says in the province of Canada, we've made some expenditures that clearly only pertain to a very local area, which he said could maybe be some of this excess number, 62.5 million. But he said all of the big things that we've incurred debt for that are going to the new Dominion are maybe worth about $62.5 million. You know, I should emphasize that he hasn't really yet gone through line by line to determine whether this is going to be true, but this is a way that he can explain this apparently differential arrangement to his colleagues in the province of Canada legislature and get these resolutions through the House. Now, there's another good explanation in Galt's own words that we have, a speech to his constituents in late 1864, where Galt describes the central government as having the powers of a public and general character. And in that, he includes the public debt, trade, national defense, what we would today call citizenship, and quote, the protection of the Indians. Provincial governments then are thought of as having limited powers over purely local subjects.
Ms. Jones, did the discussion you had about the distinction between public and local debts change the fact that the plan was for the new Dominion government to assume all of the debt?
No, it was always going to assume all of the debt. It's just that I think, again, the questions would arise in the province of Canada. Why under your structure are we paying 5% on some apparently arbitrary number? So he's trying to explain, he's trying to give it some rationale. He's just told the maritime provinces that they won't have to pay for the province of Canada's profligate borrowing, that they're going to get this, it's a roughly per capita calculation, and they're going to get money back on that calculation. And he says those people in Upper Canada that have borrowed more per capita than you have, we're not going to indirectly make your taxpayers responsible for that. We're going to get the province of Canada to pay the interest on that excess borrowing. But now he has to come back and explain to his colleagues and constituents in the province of Canada why it is that their deal looks different from what he's just promised the maritime provinces.
You referred to the provinces objecting over having to pay interest on the arbitrary number. Can you just confirm the arbitrary number is excess debt?
Yes, that's what they called it, excess debt. You can only have excess debt, of course, if you've set some kind of a number that is either excess or not excess. And the number is fairly arbitrary.
And that number is the 62.
$62.5 million.
Turning to slide 29.
So again, when Galt is trying to explain this proposal to his colleagues in the province of Canada legislature, trying to get these proposals passed, he acknowledges that this amount over 62.5 million will have to be divided in some way between the successors to Upper and Lower Canada, the province of Canada, so that the 5% that they're going to be paying on that number can be deducted from the subsidies that they're going to receive. So he recognizes that this is an issue, but he doesn't say how it's going to be solved. He tries to direct people away from that problem by saying what we have now to consider is whether the bargain as between Canada and a whole and the lower provinces, by which he means the Maritimes, ought to be assented to. So he says, let's not think yet about how that might be divided, because that's not what we're deciding. what we have to decide now is what our relationship is going to be between us and the Atlantic provinces. So those resolutions, the Quebec resolutions, were assented to by the Legislative Assembly of the Province of Canada in March of 1865.
We'll turn to slide 30.
And after those resolutions have been agreed to is when we first see the emergence of a clause regarding how to divide up how much of that 5% interest is going to be paid by Ontario and how much is going to be paid by Quebec after Confederation. We see the first discussion in the Legislative Assembly of the Province of Canada in July 1866. There's a clause regarding the arbitration of the division and adjustments of the debts, credits, liabilities, properties, and assets of the provinces of Upper and Lower Canada. This is, of course, the only situation in British North America that's like this, because all of the other colonies have been completely separate. But the province of Canada is going to be divided. So they are facing this different problem. A clause regarding the arbitration was included in a part of the resolutions of the Assembly that would deal with the structure of the future governments of Ontario and Quebec. So the structure of the local governments in August 1866. The local governments were still working out for themselves what those governments would look like. A key element of interest was how many elected representatives there were going to be in the House, what the ridings were going to look like, all of these things that are of immediate interest to people who have to be elected to a legislature. That took up a lot of time. This clause about the arbitration and the division and adjustment didn't really occupy much space in the debate at all. I think the arbitration was a pretty common resource in the private sphere in commercial disputes to resolve issues like this, how assets and liabilities would be divided up, say if a corporation was divided or if there were parties who claimed different shares in a commercial venture. So I think that most of the elected members of Parliament would have been familiar with a structure like this to settle disputes, which were thought, I think, to be primarily monetary in nature. So the next phase is for the delegates from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the province of Canada. By now, Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland have dropped out. The delegates go to London in December of 1866 to draft their final resolutions to submit to the imperial government, because it has to be imperial legislation that draws together all of these colonies into a new colonial structure. They produce their own set of resolutions in London, the delegates from the province of Canada and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. But although there are some changes, the basic financial and jurisdictional structure at Quebec has not changed. An arbitration clause was not included in the London resolutions, possibly because the delegates believed that it was a matter that related more to the provincial government rather than to the whole structure of the Confederation plan.
Are the London resolutions the resolutions of the colonies?
Yes.
They just make them when they're in London?
Right.
Thank you.
So they're made by delegates at that point. They're not the entire legislature.
We could turn to slide 31.
And then they submit the final version of the London resolutions on Christmas Eve, 1866. And then in January of 1867, the British North American delegates are still in London. And they begin working with the representatives of the imperial government to go through the normal British government processes for drafting legislation, which looks very much like it does today with the House of Commons. There are committees to go through. There are draft bills that are considered. And in that process, the clause providing for the arbitration and the division and adjustment of the debts, credits, assets, etc., was included in the final draft, which is February 1867, in a section on local constitutions. So then the bill goes to the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And on the 29th of March, 1867, the British North America Act, as we have it, at least before 1982, is given royal assent. And it's to come into effect on the 1st of July, 1867. And that date, by the way, was chosen not only because the weather is nice and you can have picnics and barbecues, but because the 30th of June, 1867 was the end of the fiscal year in the province of Canada. So we don't have a big battle or triumphant declaration or anything like that to set our national holiday. We have the end of the fiscal year.
Turn to slide 32, please. So here we're starting a new section on the provisions of the new British North America Act.
Yeah. I've just briefly gone through the provisions regarding the debt, liability, and assets here. Sections 102 to 106 establish the Consolidated Revenue Fund of Canada, into which all the duties and revenues formerly levied by the colonies would be paid, and then prioritizes the charges thereon, which include the interest on the public debt. The first charge is the cost of collection. The second charge is interest of the public debt, including the debts of the former colonies. Section 107 is that all stocks, cash, bankers' balances, securities belonging to each province shall be the property of Canada. So again, this is transferring all of these cash assets of the former colonies to the new central government. And as well, Section 108 transfers a lot of the key publicly owned infrastructure of the former colonies to the new central government. It's enumerated in a third schedule, which we will get to.
You referenced the charges that are described in the provisions. Was there any import of those charges to you when including these provisions?
In the sections 102 to 106?
Yes.
Well, in that it goes along with the financial structure that was proposed, in that Canada assumes all of the debt. If it assumes all of the debt, then the interest on the public debt becomes a charge on this new large fund, which is created in those sections.
Can we turn to slide 33?
Now we have the division of some other assets. Section 109, all the lands, mines, minerals and royalties belonging to the several provinces of Canada as they are now known, formerly colonies. And I should emphasize that there's no change in the colonial relationship by the creation of this new entity. It's just that instead of being separate colonies, they are now united into one colony. So the lands, mines, minerals, and royalties belonging to the several provinces at the Union, and all sums then due or payable shall belong to the several provinces, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, in which the same are situate, subject to any trusts existing in respect thereof, and any interest other than that of the province in the same. We will hear more about that clause for certain. And any assets connected with portions of the public debt of the province that are assumed by that province shall belong to the province. Now there's, those are, in the case of the maritime provinces, quite limited. Again, all of the public debt is essentially going to be assumed by the new central government, which is emphasized in section 111, that Canada shall be liable for the debts and liabilities of each province existing at the Union.
And we go to slide 34, you have a couple of additional provisions from the British North America Act here.
Right, so section 112 sets out that Ontario and Quebec conjointly shall be liable to Canada for the amount of the debt of the province of Canada over $62.5 million and shall be charged with interest at the rate of 5%. And that the assets enumerated in a schedule would be the property of Ontario and Quebec conjointly. Now, you'll notice one curious thing about this is that there's a provision about the charging of interest on this debt over $62.5 million, but there isn't any provision for a repayment of the debt or a reduction of the figure on which 5% will be paid. You know, I'm not too sure how much more I can say about that apart from to point it out, but it is also, there were instances, for example, with some types of imperial securities, which formed part of investment portfolios at the time, that were intended to be perpetual debt, essentially, on which interest would be paid, so guaranteed by the imperial government. So they were quite popular, for example, for pension and annuity funds. There is no redemption date on those securities. There's no repayment date. It's just an undertaking by the imperial government to pay 3% per year forever, essentially. So I don't know whether that kind of arrangement was what was contemplated in 112 or whether it was foreseen that Ontario and Quebec would never be able to pay off any of the debt, or what their thinking was. But there is no provision in the British North America Act itself for the repayment of any of this debt.
Are you happy for us to move on?
Sure.
Slide 35.
Now, 117 just emphasizes that the provinces will retain their public property, except of course for the specific things that will be assumed by Canada. And there's a right of Canada to assume any land or public property required for fortifications or defense. The section on the division and adjustment of the debts, credits and liabilities is found at section 142 in a subsection of the British North America Act entitled Ontario and Quebec. So it was a section of the British North America Act which was specifically aimed at some of the particular issues that would arise from the division of the province of Canada into two separate jurisdictions.
Go on to slide 36.
Yes. Now, just to get an idea of what's in these schedules, these are, the third schedule gives you the kinds of provincial public works and property that were going to be taken over by Canada. And this includes a lot of the major infrastructure that was associated with much of the debt that had been incurred, but also was considered to be part of the national project of building infrastructure to connect all of the former colonies and to expand into the West. So that includes all of the canal works, public harbors, even things like the steamboats and public vessels, the railways and railway stocks, which were of varying worth. Some of the railway stocks were worthless and some of them might have been worth something. The governments had assumed or guaranteed a lot of debt by railway companies. So that's the other thing that's referred to in item 6. All of the custom houses and post offices and public buildings were going to be taken over by the government of Canada, except for those which were going to be set aside for the use of the provincial legislature and governments. Ordnance property, anything to do with the military, that was all to be transferred to the central government, as well as lands set apart for general public purposes, which is a very broad clause, which I think was just meant to cover anything they forgot to mention in the third schedule that was part of their overall scheme. The fourth schedule lists the assets of the former province of Canada that, at least for the time being, were to be the property of Ontario and Quebec conjointly together. And these include some of the funds, Upper Canada Building Fund, municipal loan funds. Now, these are things that are simultaneously items of debt and also considered to be assets, because the people who owed money to these funds, it was felt could pay at least some of the money so that they would be revenue generating items. For example, the Turnpike Trust funds. This is money that had been borrowed to build roads in Lower Canada, which were then paid back by fees to use the roads. So those Turnpike trusts were in fact returning their interest to the governments every year. Those were considered to be good funds. So in a way, they represent past borrowing, but they're considered an asset because the money is being paid back. A lot of these funds are financed by sales of dedicated lands or fees charged to use specific services. The Upper Canada Building Fund is an example of that. There were lands set aside in Upper Canada where the proceeds of the lands, when sold, would go into a special fund to finance education. And out of that larger fund, the building fund, Upper Canada Building Fund, and the Lower Canada Superior Education Fund, for example, were also financed. But at this point, they're all considered to be joint assets of the two provinces.
What they're retaining and not transferring.
Yes.
Can we go to slide 37?
Now, because the new provinces had given up most of their revenue sources, the central government agreed to, first of all, provide a set sum of money just to support the basic operations of government in each province. The cost of having a legislature, the basic cost of having a civil service. And as well, there was going to be a subsidy from central government funds to each province based on the most recent census. And in the British North America Act was this hopeful phrase that such grants shall be in full settlement of all future demands on Canada, which was, of course, just a continuing source of negotiation almost immediately. But also that the government of Canada shall deduct from such grants all sums chargeable as interest on the public debt of that province. So that's the clause that sets out how, in large part, how the new provincial governments were going to be funded by the central government, and also that any interest they were paying was going to be deducted from the subsidies.
And the second last line in the first bullet where it says the public debt, is that referring to the provisions you referred to earlier?
Yes. So it says the public debt of the province, but it's all debt that has been assumed by the new central government. And then in section 119, there's a special grant to New Brunswick because New Brunswick needed a bit more money. Section 126 creates the provincial consolidated revenue funds.
If the provinces had transferred many of their assets to the federal government, what was within the province's jurisdiction for which these funds would be spent?
The provinces were going to be responsible for a number of things that were characterized as being local in character. And some of these were, particularly at the instance of Quebec, for example, such as education. Quebec very much wanted to retain control over its own educational system. The provinces, I mean, I think we're going to get to this on a subsequent slide, is what's some things that are part of section 92.
Sure.
The provinces were still going to have jurisdictional responsibilities, and it was recognized at the time of Confederation that the money that they would have from the lands, mines, and minerals and some of the other fees they were allowed to charge was not going to either replace the money or the revenue sources that they had turned over to Canada, or even to cover the expenses that they would have to incur in fulfilling those jurisdictional responsibilities. So that's the thinking behind the subsidy and this flat grant.
Can I move on to slide 38?
So these are some of the items under federal jurisdiction. And again, I cite these only to reinforce the overall vision of the British North America Act. The central government being responsible, of course, for the public debt and property that it had taken over. The regulation of trade and commerce, raising of money, borrowing of money, and section 9124, Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. These are areas which would, in which a broader approach that would be uniform across provincial boundaries would be advantageous. The idea of uniting the colonies was to eliminate all of the differentiation, for example, in export and import duties, in internal trade barriers between the colonies. Canada, as it was responsible for all of the debt, would then be responsible for raising all of the money and borrowing the money. Again, the idea was a larger entity with more resources would have more borrowing power. And I've already discussed why Indians and lands reserved for the Indians was critical to the larger national vision of the British North America as a whole.
Could you go back to that? You say you've already said it. What is it?
That it was important for the central government to assume that jurisdiction, particularly looking to the north and the west, that it would have to sign treaties under the obligations it had inherited from the imperial government. It would have to be able to fulfill those treaties with promises of land. And it was considered, I think, to be clearly a central government responsibility, so that there would be one way of executing on that inherited responsibility across all of British North America.
Go to slide 31. This is the provincial jurisdiction section you mentioned a moment ago.
That's right. So the provinces were going to be able to resort to direct taxation, which is things like sales taxes. And bear in mind, there were no income taxes at this time. But they were giving up customs duties and import and export duties, with the exception of timber. So that was really a much bigger revenue source at this time. Of course, if the provinces wanted to borrow money on the sole credit of the province, that would be under their jurisdiction. They were to be responsible for the management and sale of the public lands belonging to the province and of the timber and wood thereon. And for local works and undertakings, which excluded specifically any transportation or communications that extended outside a province or was declared by Canada to be for the general advantage of Canada or the advantage of two or more provinces. So the idea again was that the central government was not going to be dealing with every little road in every little town, but it would be dealing, say, for a road that would connect provinces, or a road that could be considered so important to the national infrastructure that it would be part of, again, that broader national vision.
Turn to slide 40.
This is in the preamble to the British North America Act, a clause expedient that provision be made for the eventual admission into the Union of other parts of British North America. And the parallel section 146 in the Act. I think this is just to emphasize that while the British North America Act was about the existing colonies and about their increased stability and economic viability, that it was at least as much about what British North America could become under one government. This is very much an outward facing document. It is addressing some key issues that were existing in the 3 colonies that joined in 1867. But the overall perspective of the British North America Act is an outward facing perspective, thinking of a much larger, broader British North American project.
Go to the next slide, 41. I note that we have about 9 minutes before we end for the day. So there's about 3 more slides that I wanted to cover, and then I think that's a new section.
So as I said, the new Confederation of British North American Colonies comes into effect on the 1st of July, 1867, in line with the end of the fiscal year. And there were a number of practical arrangements that had to be made. If you just think of how this is going to, how the new government arrangement is going to work, practically speaking, especially in the province of Canada, there are books and papers and civil servants that have to be divided up among Toronto, Ottawa, and Quebec City. For example, many of the province of Canada Crown Lands Department records and officials were transferred to Toronto. The central government had to build a new Indian branch, which they placed in the Department of Secretary of State, including William Spragg, the former chief clerk of the Crown Lands Department, and the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs as of 1860. He retains his title in the new Canadian government, and as well, another name with which you are going to become very familiar, Lawrence Fancunet, clerk in the province of Canada's Indian branch. So if you can think of that summer and what it must have been like with people moving everywhere and boxes of files going up and down the railways, some decisions having to be made on how to divide up the records and who was going to get what. Just, you know, that's the human and record keeping side of this glamorous big new national project.
Next slide, 42.
So as I've said previously, the new Department of Crown Lands in the government of the province of Ontario took most of the province of Canada's staff and the records relating to lands and natural resources, except for the records relating to Indian reserve lands. And that, it's just a little reminder as well that this record group that's called Records Relating to Indian Affairs at Library and Archives Canada has that name rather than, say, the records of a department like some of the other record groups have, because what we see now as all one record group previously would have been distributed, especially in the province of Canada, across more than one department, and was brought later on into a common record relating to Indian affairs. So those records were divided up between Ottawa and Toronto. And as a result of that and the division of responsibilities in the British North America Act, the Indian branch in the government of Canada no longer had regular access to records relating to revenues and expenditures from land in the Robinson Treaty territories. Whereas before it had all been part of one government and in some cases one department. So now these things are divided. And as well, their work started on working on the financial records of the province of Canada and establishing a financial framework for the 3 new governments that had been created, the government of Canada, the province of Ontario, the province of Quebec. All of the records that would relate to those new governments somehow had to be divided up and new account structures set up. So in 1867, for example, the Treasurer of Ontario wrote to the Auditor General of Canada asking for a statement showing the revenues of Ontario and Quebec for 1866 to 1867 fiscal year, and giving him an idea of how the revenues and expenditures would be divided up after the 1st of July, 1867. So that he could get, quote, a clear, intelligent, and comprehensive idea of the financial position of Ontario. Not an unreasonable request. What he's asking for is some kind of a division of the old records of the province of Canada so that he could see how much revenue based on the previous fiscal year he might be able to expect and what his expenditures might be.
Go to slide 43.
So the reply that Mr. Wood, the Treasurer of Ontario, gets from the Auditor General, Mr. Langton, is that responding to this request would tax all the available force of my office to the utmost, bearing in mind that Mr. Langton's staff were probably already fully engaged in trying to set up new books for the new central government and trying to account for all of the debt which they had assumed from all of the colonies and paying all of the creditors of the former colonies who were expecting payments at certain times. So Mr. Langton's response is that this additional request from the Treasurer of Ontario would just be beyond their capabilities, essentially. And Langton noted as well that there were a lot of outstanding items on the books, including the outcome of the arbitration on how some of the debts and assets of the province of Canada was going to be divided. So that was going to have a significant impact on Ontario's financial position as well, and that was not set up yet. So in January of 1868, Ontario appoints its arbitrator under Section 142. Shortly afterwards, Quebec and Canada appoint their arbitrators to begin this process.
Thank you. So I think that brings us to the end of that section, and we can start fresh with the preparation for arbitration tomorrow,
Thank you very
Thursday.
much.
Thursday.
And Your Honor, I understand that there was provision to start at 9 if it was necessary. And I think that we should at least start on Thursday to see how far we get, and then we can decide whether the early start is necessary on Friday.
Very good. Does that work for everyone? 9 o'clock then on Thursday we'll start. Thank you.
All right. The sittings of this court have now concluded. Long live the people.